Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Hill, and I'm the treasurer of the American Society for Cellular and Computational Toxicology. And I'd like to welcome you to this December webinar, which is held jointly with the European Society for Toxicology in vitro. Before we get started with today's program, I would like to encourage all participants to learn more about our societies. You can visit our websites, learn about different activities that we have going on. I would encourage you to become a member if you're not a member. Your membership helps to fund programs like this webinar series, also to provide travel grants for young researchers to attend meetings in the area of new approach methodologies. I'd like to draw your attention to an upcoming webinar. This one is the next in a series of the PEP webinars, which at the bottom of the screen you can see stands for the PETA Science Consortium together with the EPA and PCRM. And this is a dynamic discussion which will discuss frameworks for establishing scientific confidence in new approach methodologies, part 1. You can scan the QR code down in the left-hand corner to learn about registration fees, and you can also find out more about this at the PETA Science Consortium International website. For a look at some of our upcoming webinars in our joint series, we'll be featuring some of our award winners. In January, we will have 3 of our award winners presenting their different research. So the registration is currently open at the website that you see down below in the right-hand corner. So before I go on, a couple of other notes for you this morning. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted at the ASCCT site within a couple of days. So you can access that and all of our previously recorded webinars there. We have 2 wonderful speakers today who will be giving a presentation and then looking forward to discussion and questions from you. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. You can do that while they're speaking or wait until the end of the presentations. There is a closed caption on right now. If you would like to turn that off, you can do that through your toolbar. And to get started, we'd love to hear in the chat, say hello, tell us where you're visiting from today and joining us in all different parts of the world. It's always nice to see the wide range of geographies joining the webinar. So I'd like to start with an introduction of our speakers, first with Dr. Paul Whaley, who specializes in approaches to improving the conduct, use, and publishing of scientific research in the domains of toxicology and human environmental health. He is a research fellow at the Evidence-Based Toxicology Collaboration and editor-in-chief of the new journal Evidence-Based Toxicology. And our second speaker today will be Dr. Sofia Batista Leite. She is a scientific officer at the European Joint Research Center in the unit that hosts ECVAM. And before that, she was a test method developer for more than 10 years. With a PhD in biochemistry and biotechnology, she has worked with stirred bioreactors, organ on a chip, and other 3D systems for use in toxicology and biomedical sciences. Since joining the JRC, alongside of promoting strategies that establish reliability and robustness of methods, she has been exploring knowledge-sharing strategies to build trust and promote transparency of these methods. So with that, I'd like to ask Paul to start his presentation.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'll just start sharing my screen. And if you could just confirm that you can see it. Excellent. Good, yes, so thank you ever so much for having me. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to speak to you all. I'll be presenting on this new tool, PRIVAT, which is for facilitating the peer review of in vitro studies. I've already been fantastically introduced by Erin, so I won't say any more about myself. This is a slide just to declare interests. I won't go through it in detail. It's just to say that we didn't identify anything in my personal circumstances that would have led to compromising the integrity of this research that I'm going to be talking about. And I really need to acknowledge a very, very large number of people who've been involved in this project over a number of years, who've done fantastic work, including Caroline Hoymans and Rob de Vries at Radboud University, Nikki Osborne at Responsible Research and Practice, who was on the operations side of the research and would have been completely impossible without her participation. A host of people at NTP and ICF as contractors, Rob Wright is a librarian at Johns Hopkins University, and Steve Watton, who's a consultant who's been helping us with some of the statistical analysis behind this project. So I work for an organisation called the Evidence-Based Toxicology Collaboration. We're based at Johns Hopkins University. We're international member-driven collaboration for improving how we create, use and publish evidence in toxicology. We view evidence-based toxicology as consisting of 4 pillars around raising research standards, making sense of evidence using systematic methods, promoting fair data, open science, and generally improving access to research, and advocating evidence-based decision-making. PRIVAT is a tool that we've been working on for about 4 years now, which we hope will contribute to improve standards for primary research. So I'm going to give you an overview of the tool today, and I'm going to give you a quick summary of the methods used in its development, a little bit of a note on the prospects for its future use, and what I hope will do is that will open up an interesting discussion amongst ourselves for how tools like PRIVAT can potentially improve peer review, particularly in the context of what a complex process peer review and publishing actually is. Obviously, the tool isn't published yet, so this is a sneaky marketing presentation, really, where we try to get you excited as we finalize the manuscripts. If you want to hear about it and it's published, you can subscribe to the EBTC newsletter. You can follow me on Twitter. If you want to be directly involved in more of this sort of thing yourselves, and we warmly encourage that, you can join EBTC through the link on this slide that I'll pop in the chat in a bit, and you can also zap that QR code with your phone on your camera on your phone. So, improving the comprehensiveness and transparency of peer review. We know that peer review is a somewhat unreliable mechanism for quality control in publishing. So we know that lots of studies get published, they've gone through peer review, through editorial triage and so forth, and they still have important limitations present. And a certain amount of this is going to be expected because research is complicated and uncertain, but some of it's maybe a little bit too much. Part of the problem, by no means all of it, is that it's a matter of chance if reviewers cover everything in a manuscript. And I'm sure from your own experience of doing peer review, you'll know that different reviewers will remember to check different things. Like I think on a day-to-day basis, I remember some things and forget others. So my own personal peer reviews are probably quite inconsistent in what I managed to remember to check. Different peer reviewers obviously also have different competencies in what they will attend to in detail. So I'm not a statistician. So the statistics parts of studies, I tend to just kind of like gloss over and hope that one of the other peer reviewers in the pool that the editor has chosen are competent in that area. And we also have different assumptions, I think, between us about what's important when it comes to publishing a study. So I'm like a methodologist, I'm interested in systematic review. I pay a lot of attention to issues in study design that may introduce systematic error. But because I'm not a content expert, I may be paying less attention to like the theoretical work behind a study about how, for example, the in vitro model they're dealing with presents a good model for the larger biology that it's supposed to be informative of. And this all adds up to a situation where we know that peer reviewers look at different things, but it's often not transparent how comprehensive a set of reviews are. So speaking as an editor, it's very difficult for me to tell from the way peer review is currently conducted what's been missed quite often in a set of peer review studies. So here we'd have reviewer 1 looking at these parts of the manuscript, reviewer 2 looks at this section of the manuscript, so with some overlap with what reviewer 1 has done. Reviewer 3 has some overlap with both, but there's this kind of missing bit, and it's an invisible missing bit because nobody's talked about it. And as an editor, it's really difficult to know if there's something we should have been paying attention to that we've inadvertently overlooked because of the heterogeneity of the peer reviewers we have involved in the process. So we think, checklists should help with this, and obviously people have published a lot of study appraisal checklists over the years. They're good because they can help reviewers cover everything, because they're a reminder of everything that the checklist creators think is important, and they provide explicit guidance on that. And because it's a checklist, it's easy for an editor to see what's not been covered, right? But they tend not to be very well used. And I think part of it is because peer review is also, to some extent, a creative process. There's also an issue of each paper being very different, the issues raised by a paper also being very different. So it's not clear there's like a box-checking approach as such that's going to solve this problem of inconsistent peer review just in its own right. So what we wanted to do with PRIVAT was identify what's important for reviewers of in vitro studies to check, and then create a tool that would help them do this in a way that's quite consistent and quite comprehensive, but in a way that would also allow flexibility, and see if we could walk that tightrope between the kind of unstructured data, that reviewers are trying to assess, but impose enough structure that we can improve the consistency and the quality of peer reviews. And in particular, we wanted to create a tool that would directly help an editor make a well-informed decision about accepting a study or sending it back for revisions, or potentially, if things haven't quite worked out for everybody, rejecting it. So we ended up with a tool which has 6 domains and 27 questions. And for anyone on the call who's immediately panicked about being asked 27 questions, it does feel like a lot, we know that. But in practice and in testing, it seems that actually it's a perfectly reasonable number of questions to ask, and it's very manageable. And if you think about doing a peer review, if you spent 5 minutes on each question, you still have spent less time than you would probably in the 4 hours or so that a typical paper maybe takes to evaluate. There's a prompt in the tool for the amount of revision required to address any of the issues, and there's some free text to explain judgment. So this is what the tool looks like at the moment. It is, because we didn't have the budget yet for converting this into a web application, it is, even if I do say so myself, a beautifully structured Word document. Obviously, if you've got eyes like mine, you're going to be struggling to read that. So I'm just going to zoom in for us on the objectives and goals to the first domain of the tool, just to show you the individual pieces that the tool covers. So we've got, obviously, the study quality theme as forming the section of the tool. In this case, we're talking about objectives and knowledge goals. Within the section, there are a set of questions. So in this question, it's the first question in the domain. So it's asking, are the authors sufficiently clear about the hypothesis or hypotheses they're investigating? And it's expected that the peer reviewer would answer each of the questions in the tool. Then they can summarize their opinion of the seriousness of the issues that they have identified in that particular relation to that particular question. And this ranges from there being critical issues that would potentially be grounds for rejection, major issues that require reanalysis or additional experimental work. There are moderate and minor issues that can be addressed through simple revision of text in a manuscript. There might be no issues at all that the reviewer is concerned about, or the reviewer can show that they're unsure of how to answer the question. And this is useful for indicating that an issue has been covered by the reviewer, but rather than the reviewer just having nothing to say, they can say that actually they didn't really know how to answer the question, so the editor knows to ask another peer reviewer maybe to pay special attention to that if they feel like that's undercovered across the set of peer reviews they've invited. So in this particular case, for example, because I'm not a statistician, if these were the statistics questions in PRIVAT, then I'd probably be checking unsure how to answer, and I would hope that that would be useful for the editor to then just get another statist, maybe a specialist statistician in to cover those areas that I haven't been able to. And then finally, there's a comment box, which is free text, where the peer reviewer can explain to the authors why they made the judgment they did and what they think the authors can do to address the issues they have identified. So PRIVAT consists of 6 domains. It's probably 7 domains, isn't it, if I think about it? Anyway, so a certain number of domains. Objectives and knowledge goals, where we talk about the hypotheses for the research, the rationale for its conduct, and whether it's in exploratory or confirmatory mode. There's the experimental setup itself, which is largely about how well the experiment tests the hypothesis and how well it generalizes to the broader biology it's supposed to be informative of. There's the issue of power and replicates. There is the issue of safeguards against systematic errors, so the things that researchers might do that might introduce bias into the study that maybe needs to be acknowledged as limitations. This can include things like authentication of cell lines and exposures. It can have things to do like the masking of the investigators to make sure that their expectations about the study results aren't influencing their interpretation of the study results. There are issues of generation and reporting of results, which are things like the use of appropriate statistical methods, the provision of raw data and code, the potential selectivity in reporting of the results of a study. There's the interpretation of results itself, in particular, for example, making sure that there's a good understanding of the limitations in the methods and how those might impact the findings of the study. And then there's this kind of other issues bucket, which you put things like declaration of interest into, ethics clearance, whether or not the abstract is a true reflection of the body of the manuscript. And that gives us the full set of things that we're asking peer reviewers to consider. And hopefully this is comprehensive when it comes to making a decision about whether or not the manuscript is ready for publication. So the methods we used for developing PRIVAT, it used to be called IVCAT, and I've missed that in this slide. We followed 3 basic steps. We think we've been more rigorous than most people when it comes to developing new tools and instruments for study assessment. We did a systematic review of in vitro appraisal tools. We then ran a 2-stage Delphi process to determine what the final evaluation criteria in PRIVAT should be. And then we did a prototype A/B test to compare 2 different versions of the tool to see which was the most usable. So our survey or systematic review of the available in vitro tools, we found 67 had been published in total. This kind of chimes with recent study by Tran and colleagues, who found a very similar number with a large amount of overlap between the 2, so we think we got almost everything. The 67 tools had 998 criteria for evaluating in vitro studies. We normalized that to get rid of trivial linguistic differences between the criteria and found that in total there are probably 676 unique criteria across the 67 tools, which is still a lot of criteria. And we categorized those in 63 assessment categories. This creates an item bank for future use, so people will never, ever, ever have to spend 2 years looking at all the existing in vitro tools again, and provides a method, hopefully, that's extendable, so people can follow our methodology relatively easily. The literature survey that we did showed that overall, the existing tools, generally speaking, in aggregate, have covered pretty much everything that needs to be thought about when thinking about assessing research, particularly from a peer review perspective, but there was greater and lesser coverage of different issues depending on the types of tools we're dealing with. And overall, in particular, the analysis of objectives in these different instruments that have been put forward was probably an area which was somewhat undercovered. So it did give us enough to create a straw man tool for a Delphi process. So here we had 15 panelists. They were selected for diversity of gender, geography, experience, and in background, so being like industry, academia, NGOs. Their identity was unknown to us as the investigators, so that's the work that Nikki Osborne did. We ran through 2 rounds where we were asking the Delphi participants if the questions that we had currently got included in the draft assessment tool should be there, or if they shouldn't be there, if we had left anything out that was important, and if the wording of the questions that we had included was optimal for a peer review assessment process. We started with 37 questions at the beginning, and were able to knock out 10 questions to give us 27 well-crafted questions by the end. We then did an A/B prototype test, because we didn't know the best way to elicit responses to questions. We had 2 kind of theories about how to do this. So we asked the Delphi participants to compare the 2 prototypes on some published in vitro studies. So we could get feedback on which their preferred, or what aspects of the 2 prototypes that we were presenting were preferable to them. The test evaluations included 2 published papers. We jiggled things around to make sure that different Delphi participants were evaluating the prototypes and the papers in different orders, so we didn't have learning effects in our evaluation process. Interestingly, one of these two published papers was consistently rejected by the participants, or there was a consistent reject recommendation rather coming out of these evaluations. Both papers ended up with major revisions being recommended, so they probably wouldn't have been published in the form that they were if the PRIVAT tool had been applied to them. We need a larger test sample, obviously, but this is an indicator that the tool would make a difference to peer review and editors' decisions if it was used. So that's quite exciting to us. We also then asked some questions about usability, and in general, the Delphi participants were of the view that it was about the right length, that it took about the right amount of time to complete, that it made appropriate revision recommendations, was reasonably intuitive to use. Now, not everybody felt the same way, like we would expect that, because different people approach peer review in different ways, and this isn't a one-size-fits-all instrument. It's just supposed to help, hopefully, most of the people, most of the time. Would they use it? So just over two-thirds of our participants said they would regularly use it or use it every time, which again, we found very encouraging. Next steps, obviously we need a lot more user testing. We need to try it out. So if you want to help us try it out, then I strongly suggest you email me, say that you're interested, and we can work with you on that. We are more than happy to offer people training in peer review and how to use PRIVAT as a tool. And we're also very interested in talking to editors and other people about how this tool might be implemented by journals. And we can do some testing with journals, we can do some education for peer reviewers, we can talk to editors, so anyone with any ideas about that, I'd be very interested in hearing that too. Kind of circling back finally to the topic of this webinar, we do think our tool might change advice to editors. We need to do some research into how that might be the case, so kind of on-the-ground testing would, I think, be appropriate at this point. We do know that securing uptake of tools is challenging. There are many tools, few tools are used regularly, so overcoming that is something that would be interesting to discuss. We know that publishing is complicated. We know that peer review is complicated. We know that tools are only a small part of a very complicated process. So it would also be very interesting to discuss what impact tools themselves can have in the context of all the other issues that make peer review somewhat wobbly when it comes to kind of a validation or kind of approval process, I guess, for published manuscripts. I look forward very much to discussing all of these things with you on our webinar today. So I just say thank you very much for listening. EBTC operates a Cochrane-like model. We have members running collaborative projects through thematic working groups. If you would like to get involved, then zap that QR code or click that link that I'll be sharing shortly. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Paul. That was a very nice overview. Some of us at IIVS were involved in the assessment of this tool, so I'm really curious to see how the audience feels about it and how it might be used. So please, I encourage everyone to put their questions in the Q&A box and direct those to one of our speakers. And with that, we'll turn it over to Sofia.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin. And congratulations, Paul. It was really wonderful presentation. I didn't know about this tool, but I think there is probably space for collaboration with us. Yeah, after you hear my talk. So today I'm going to talk to you about an activity that we started in summer, and you probably realized that the title, it's not the same as it was announced for the webinar, because although we started in summer, we were struggling to have a proper name and a proper acronym that would reflect this activity, but we finally managed before this webinar, and it's ProMap. So it's about promoting reusable and open methods and protocols. And here on the slide, you can see the main team, the coordination team that has been working on this, but we are many more, and I will tell you more about it. So just before I start my talk, I just want you to take a second to think on the times that you were reading a paper and you wanted to check how the study was conducted. So the details of the method. If you could find easily the type of cells that were used, the origin of the cells, if there was used serum or not. And I also want you to think about it if you work in the lab, about the times that you were trying to recreate this method because you want to reproduce the data or because you wanted to use the method for something else, and how easy it was to do it, or even to try to understand the methodology, a new methodology that you came across in the paper. And I'm almost sure that the majority of you will resonate with what is shown in this slide that was shared with me by Emma Ganley from protocols.io. Often we go to the methods part and you see a reference to another paper that goes to another paper that goes to another paper, and it's an endless process of shortcut citation that it's very frustrating. And I don't know how many of you have thrown the laptop over the window. I never did it, but a lot of times I felt like doing it. So this is the project that I wanted to tell you about. So the ones that know our work. So I'm from the European Commission Joint Research Center in the unit of chemical safety and alternative methods that hosts the ERL ECVAM. And one of our main business is the methods, the non-animal methods, but as one method like any other methods. And we want to promote them for regulatory purpose and for research through collaboration with researchers, validation, dissemination, and promotion. And it's all about bringing trust on the methods. So to have trust on the methods, we feel that it's necessary to have enough information about them. So we host the DBL, you might know, which is a database for protocols and methods of non-animal methods with detailed instruction on how to perform. But although we like this type of job, we also felt it was very limiting for the needs of the community. So we start to look in also to the place where the majority of researchers and scientists go to look for information, which is the peer review publications. So to see what it's out there, how can you find your methods and protocols, even if you don't know about DBLM or ECVAM. So that's how we started an internal study, me and my colleague Ivana Campia, about methods and protocols in peer review publications. What is the community doing about it? And to switch the process from being the one-stop shop by working with the community to improve clarity of protocols. And our first conclusion, as the majority of you might also agree, it's that the majority of publications don't give enough value to the methods section. So often it's not described with enough detail that can be not only reproduced, but also understood by people that don't understand the new methodology. So, and this was not only our feeling. For the ones that are aware of the studies that we have been doing, that we are building these databases for different disease of in vitro methods or non-animal methods for different disease. Also, we, from the people that were doing this study and collecting this information, they reported back that was very difficult to know with enough detail the methods they were using. Sometimes they were struggling to know if they would use in vivo or not, because they wanted to restrict these only to non-in vivo methods. And they felt also with the in vitro, that's why I'm very happy with this PRIVAT application. In vitro, a lot of times the level of reporting was lower than with in vivo, and that was their feeling. So through the times of years, we have seen a lot of reporting on bad studies on bad reporting, but I wanted to call your attention for something that we found more worrying. So a couple of years ago, you might have seen this on the news that half of the top cancer studies fail high-profile reproducibility effort. This was a project that was aiming to replicate 50 high-impact cancer papers, and they stopped after 18 because they were not able to reproduce the studies. And if you go to their website, this is the Reproducible Project Cancer Biology, they already point several issues why this reproducibility was not possible, being one of them the fact that they were lacking detailed protocols. So often you don't find it in publications. So this is where we want to focus. So we know there is a lot of effort putting in data and having fair data, And this is of course important, but can you really trust the data if you don't know how this data was generated? So it is important to have enough information about the methodology, how the data was generated, so you can use it and trust it. So, and we have seen open access and open data do not guarantee reproducibility, but open methods probably yes. So why it is important to sharing protocols and methods? Because it's a matter of being transparent. It's a way to advance in science, to transfer science, is because reproducibility is core in science, and we should all agree with this, but also because it's a way to translate science. So if you can advance in science, you have enough information, then you will have more translation of science and also impact citizens. And all in all, it's about trust. And for our community that want to promote more the use of in vitro methods or in silico methods, it is important that these methods are trustable. And for this, it's important to have enough information about it. So second conclusion of our initial internal study is that there is a group within the community that is aware of this issue and it's trying to do something about it. So to improve the protocol descriptions in peer review publication. So we started to interview some of these people to understand more about the process. And then we decided to join this community and to have a workshop that we did here just in Ispra, Italy, just before summer. So we had a committee, so a coordinator committee that was also externals from the GRC that helped us identify the people. And we wanted to have representatives from the publishers and editors, from funders, because we were pointed by the editors that a lot of effort should be done also from the funders. Of course, the researchers, that would be the authors and the reviewers of these publications, and platform managers. So it was crucial that the help we had from Bern Pulverev, the editor-in-chief of EMBO, that has been in a lot of different processes promoting the transparency, and he has a very good network of editors. And he pointed out in our workshop when they first start their first efforts back in 2012 on how to join their efforts and having a more transparency reporting, which has been reflected in the transparency reporting of data, but also efforts like DORA, if you're aware of DORA, and MDAR, which is a checklist for editors and for authors on being more transparent in reporting. But still, none of those efforts were putting so much attention in methods. So then we have also, I like this slide from Emma, which is from protocols.io, where she picked up this image from a normal magazine that showed if you would trickle just one detail in a cookies recipe, you could have these many different types of cookies, which in kitchen might be good and might be still delicious, but in science, we don't want to have these many types of studies from the same protocol. So that's why it is important to have the exactly details, the exact material, the type of pipettes that it's necessary if it's going to affect your protocol. And then we were lucky to have the presence also from Cell Press and Nature Protocols. And here Elisa showed us why the good reporting, it's obviously good for the users, but also advantage from the author perspective. So within Cell Press, they have the STAR protocol, which is a link within the paper to the protocols that help us to be more accurate in the reporting, showcase the technical expertise, get credit for their work. So how many of us have been working in the lab optimizing protocols and always feeling that we don't have credit enough for this effort of days and days of work, that it's never rewarded? And also to update the protocols when needed. So this type of platforms like STAR protocols or protocols.io gives you the opportunity to give different versions of the protocol, because protocols are something dynamics and they evolve with time. So it's important to put the different versions that are being generated. And also we had the time to present GIVIM, so it's good OECD guidance on good in vitro practices that has been recently translated to a checklist, also by my colleague Ingrid, and this is for in vitro. And she even pointed out the type of things that normally it's missing on publications, and this is something that she came across when she was going through the thyroid validation process with a lot of methods being collected from publication. There is still a lot that it's missing there. So then we had the question in the workshop. So we all agreed within this crowd that methods and protocols are important, and we were very much aligned. So how do we bring this up in the importance of peer review? That was the question. So during the workshop, we had analyzed why people don't report. Of course, there are multiple motives. It's because sometimes they feel they cannot share, or they don't want to share their most precious thing, that is the method, and give enough detail. Other times it's because they don't have the space to report it, because it's so short, the space being given to the methods, or because they feel that there is not enough recognition, or maybe they don't need to give so much information, that the information that it's there, it's more than enough for others to repeat. So this was the discussions among the people. Here you can see the list of the people, of the participants and their affiliations. We had several editors and publishers there from, and also so we had EMBO, we had Spring Nature, we had Cell, but also F1000 and eLife. We had platforms, so protocols.io, bioprotocols, and also funders. We also involve NC3Rs and the work that they are doing in ARRIVE guidelines, and also in the RIVER guidelines for in vitro. And these started a discussion. So some of these people joined after the workshop because we started an activity. So we have been having a lot of meetings because we agreed to have this ProMap project and to have a recommendation for the rest of the community. So we agreed what we want finally. It's from one publication. When it comes to the material and methods, you can have a link to a proper protocol with enough detail for others to reproduce and understand. And we need that the methods and protocols to be detailed, clear, complete, transferable, reusable, dynamic, transparent, reliable, reproducible, and open. It seems a lot, but it's a way to progress in science. And with a little initial effort, then I think we can achieve it, because a lot of these journals there, or several of these journals, not a lot, several of these journals already have this in place with good success rates and good feedback from the users. So we start building a list of recommendations because we feel that we need to do this as community. And we divided this type of recommendations into 3 different groups, and we are working in these 3 parallel groups and giving recommendations for researchers, editors, and funding agencies on they could support in this endeavor. Of course, we cannot mandate, but what we want with this is to give resources and ideas on how they could support this initiative. So in general, what we aim with this is to increase awareness. So we want to produce a document that increases awareness of the different people in these groups about this issue that they might not be aware. How it can be achieved to have good methods and protocols reporting, because we also report what is a good method and what is a good protocol. Developing better means and tools to share and publish protocols. So have tools that help the reporting of protocols, but also the screening of these protocols. And to increase funding and investing in education and good reporting. So based on this, I will quickly go through some of the main recommendations that we are giving for the different groups. So from the research institutions and researchers, we want this to be embedded in their culture, so that they use protocols. And this seems a bit of a joke, but many times we don't have in the labs protocols for all the assays that are being done. And these were often reporting by the members of this group. So it is important to really ensure that they use protocols within the labs to have relevant guidelines, avoid the shortcut citations. Yeah. So to instead of describing your protocol, put the citation of another paper. This is not good to promote transparency. You should only use the reference of another paper to give credit, but still describing your protocol. So to be linked to dynamic protocols, so these type of platforms that allow you to have different versions of the protocol, but always in the same platform, not to have duplicates. Training rewards. The institution should reward people that has a good practice in terms of protocols, and this can be by in their CV, by giving prizes, awards, promotions, and also embedded in the PhD thesis and master thesis. Then in terms of recommendations for editors, and I have to say this is the most active group we have, and they are very much aligned. And although they know all the recommendations we give, it's not possible for all types of journals, still they agree these are good recommendations for the different journals and editors to pick up from. So the idea is to promote the access to detailed protocols. So to ensure and allow enough detail, it means having no word limits for the methods, and also not be covered by copyright, so that we can use exactly the same text from one paper to another in the methods section. To promote the use of structured methods, so the methods it's described according to the different assays and all the assays being used in the paper and in the figures. To link again to these platforms that can allow version, forking, and dynamic protocols, and not put the methods in supplementary data. They are important enough not to be placed there, but in a structured way. So avoid again shortcut citations and update the guides for authors and reviewers accordingly. And finally, for the funding agencies, so that they are aware of this issue is important, and they should support open protocols. So as far as possible to ask their awardees or in their grants that the studies that are published are linked to detailed protocols. Still to reward good practices, reward their, if it's put on CVs, to give prizes and awards. Focus on early career researchers, and this sometimes when we discuss is a bit controversial, but they are the majority of the people that work in the lab, and if they start early enough and having training on these, it's obviously a good investment. So for that, it's important also to have funding for training and dedicating actions, and to develop tools that help screening these protocols, help editors, but also help the funders to screen if these kind of practices are put in place. So to finalize, and in case it's still not obvious for you why this is so important also for the non-animal methods community, we see that from many times regulators tend not to trust some data, and this is information feedback that we had, because they don't know how it was generated. When it's done with animals, that it's a method or a model they know well, it's easy, but when it's done in other types of models and methods, it's more difficult because there is not enough information in the publications. So this is one, and the other is we have seen, and we also heard feedback from these systematic reviews and from others, and that publications with animals tend to be more scrutinized, and so they tend to have more detailed information. Why in vitro, because of, or in silico, because of different things, well, I think the lack it's more on in vitro, it's still lacking this information because of ethics. Of course, animals, when people use animals, they feel that they need to have much more information on how it was done, because it's mandated by the funding entities, because there are more guidelines enforcing so that the journals have these guidelines, and because it's compulsory to have training to manipulate animals, which is not in vitro. And when you have training to manipulate, then you're also trained on the reporting. and because in general they are more scrutinized. So it is important to invest in same type of standards for non-animal methods, and PRIVAT maybe it's one of the solutions for this. So this is the ProMap roadmap. We have started with this workshop and we have been very, very active working on this. We are at this phase, finalizing the first draft and having some ad hoc interaction with people outside the project to give us feedback. And we will have a final document beginning in the first quarter of next year. We hope that we will disseminate. So I hope I managed to convince you that it's important to have good reporting of protocols and methods in publications to increase transparency, reproducibility, trust in methods and data, and to advance in science. I would finally like to thank all the people involved in this project. So the consultations we did before starting more actively, so before the workshop, the people that had attended the workshop and has been very active to work after that. And thank you for listening. And if you want to have more information on this, please contact me. Or if you would like to have some kind of more active role, you can also contact me. I also give my Twitter and LinkedIn details. And just a last word for our GRC summer school coming next year in May, and registrations are already open. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofia. Indeed, I can see a lot of overlap in your work and with Paul's presentation and the PRIVAT tool. So we have some different questions right now in the Q&A, and a couple of them overlap. They're for Paul, wondering if the tool might be appropriate beyond in vitro studies, so to all types of toxicology, manuscripts, or even review articles. Could you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting question, and something that through our analysis of all of the in vitro appraisal tools that the 67 we were looking at, what we found is that quite a lot of in vitro appraisal tools are based on original tools that were never designed for the in vitro context anyway. And in spite of that, came up with some reasonably compelling way of interpreting those guidelines for the in vitro context. And then going through the tool development and Delphi process that we did, we had quite a few observations from the Delphi participants that actually a lot of the criteria and questions that were going into the PRIVAT tool were in fact very generalizable. So I think we're seeing from two directions that when it comes to study design, that many of the principles of study design are universal regardless of topic or particular experimental design. I think in primary research in particular, because mainly research is conducted on what we'd call the hypothetico-deductive model, right? So you have a conjecture that you look to test through an experiment that you then analyze to generate findings. And then there are some components of that just seem to be universally, kind of these universal kind of domains, I guess, of method. And then what matters is in some of the specifics of the interpretation. So if we're trying to create a general purpose in vitro assessment tool, then because we're trying to generalize across multiple in vitro designs, then it'll probably have quite good generalizability even to, say, in vivo or epidemiological research, because we've already made it very generalizable. What will be difficult, I think, will be interpreting from the general principles to the specifics of a particular study design, how much they matter. So what we're hoping to do with, say, something like PRIVAT is provide some in vitro specific structure, but then that has to be understood as being embedded in a peer review process where people are being selected for their familiarity with the particulars of the experimental designs and things being dealt with. So they kind of know exactly what questions to ask through these prompts for these specific experimental setups. Does that make sense? So like we're trying to provide a general structure, but it still leans a lot on individual expertise, because a lot of this stuff can't be formalized or generalized in some useful way in some finite number of questions. A lot of it leans, I think, on the tacit knowledge and understanding of the people doing the reviews.
That leads into other comments and questions from Horst Spielman, who of course has been an editor for many, many years. And one of his questions is, does the tool in any way help to select the right reviewers? As we know, sometimes it's difficult to have papers reviewed, so we often send them to people that we know will get them done. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best people to be reviewing. And to circle back to something that you said, Paul, in your introduction, which was we ideally would have a pool of reviewers who have experience in the different area. So if you're a reviewer, clearly we need someone with some statistics background, because you're lacking in that. I am as well. So can you speak to whether the tool covers helping us getting the right people in a peer review?
So the short answer is no, definitely not, because it's designed to help a peer reviewer who has already been selected. So we can't, through a study assessment instrument, seek to influence the processes that journals need in place to ensure that peer review is working properly. That's a different set of interventions at a different point in the manuscript handling workflow. So we very deliberately just didn't try to do any of that. So I think, speaking as an editor, obviously securing a reasonable breadth of expertise and competence and timeliness and so on and so forth from the pool of peer reviews you have available is like an ever-present challenge. What we try to do was make sure that when peer review is done, that the editor understands what it is that their reviewers have and have not covered, and increase the likelihood that an individual peer reviewer would remember to cover everything in their individual peer review.
Thank you. Sophia, there's a question for you. It was actually in the chat, but it might be coming over to the Q&A, asking you about your thoughts on RRIDs and whether those can be mandated for all journals.
So it is included in our recommendations, both for researchers and for editors. So the ones that are not familiar are RIDs. It's the unique identifier for materials that you, so when you use a specific material, you should put this code, and so people make sure that it's always the same material. So it is there. None of the things that we are writing, we can really mandate the journals to do it. We hope that we reach out to as many journals and editors as possible to follow these guidelines. So we know the ones that are on board of this project are willing to do it or already doing it, but it's pointed there because also many people don't know about it. So we put the information there. Yes, it's a very good point.
Great. There are a couple of comments asking whether the tool could be required by editors of journals. That might be the holy grail for you, Paul, to have it be required. But maybe you could speak to that more broadly, of how we get this tool into use and into practice.
Yeah, so I think it would be bad for journal editors to like just hard require it, because we've already seen from Delphi process and then the AB prototype testing that we did, that probably 2/3, assuming this pool generalizes, that maybe 50%, let's be less optimistic, so 50% of peer reviewers feel that the tool would be helpful to them. They find it a combination of intuitive enough and practically useful enough and appealing enough that they feel like it's improving their review. So we wouldn't want to force people who didn't find the tool helpful to use it for doing peer review, because that would probably just doesn't sound like a good idea, right? But what would be good is if we had ways of training people in the use of the tool to make them feel more comfortable with it, thereby increasing that percentage of people who feel the tool is helpful. If we can generate things like user communities around these kinds of tools, so people can ask each other questions about the particular experience of using it, get advice from each other on the implementation of the tool, so you have this kind of supportive social framework around the use of these things, that would probably also increase people's comfort with the tool, and would also create opportunities, I think, for improving and refining it. You know, maybe we could kind of spin off individual like forks, right? Like Sofia was talking about with protocol. So we could fork the tool for very specific use contexts and things, and all that kind of stuff would increase the use of the tool without necessarily having to make it compulsory, which could have unintended negative consequences. I think I covered everything you said there.
Yes, I generally agree about it with your comments. One thing that I've thought about within our institute is asking our scientists who are doing peer review to utilize a tool, suggesting this tool, but to use some tool. Because I think while researchers spend a lot of time learning how to write a paper, they're not necessarily trained in how to do a peer review. And that's something that you mentioned, Paul, that perhaps the EBTC is going to offer some trainings in how to conduct a peer review.
Oh, absolutely. If someone just asks us, we will do it. Like we don't even have to offer it. We can just be asked for it. We'll make the time. I think coming back to this idea of peer reviewers using tools, I think, so I was chatting to a guy called Chris Chambers who set up something called Peer Community and Registered Reports, and has been involved in thinking about how editors interact with peer reviewers for much, much longer than I have. And he was emphasizing to me that peer reviewers are working with editors. So just having a peer reviewer use a tool is you know, it can be helpful, but it's probably neither necessary nor sufficient, in the sense that if you've got an editor who thinks about the research in an extremely structured way, then they can take an unstructured peer review, figure out what issues the peer review has covered and which ones they haven't through their own structured thinking. And once they've got kind of a grab bag of comments from 3 different peer reviewers, they can provide that structure in a way that maybe the peer reviewers then don't need to. So his opinion is that so long as someone in that process, either the peer reviewers or the editor, are being very, very structured, then not everybody has to be incredibly structured. So peer community and registered reports, they don't have structured peer review. It's the editor who structures the peer review. And then we had a long conversation about PRIVAT and the CREST tool I have for evaluating systematic reviews, and he kind of sort of changed his mind a bit. But yeah, there's definitely, when we think about improving publishing, we do have to think about the interplay between the editors and the peer reviewers and the authors, and the need for, in particular, structured editorial triage, which I think is a really important piece of the process, which is missing. And what we're thinking about doing is modifying PRIVAT for being supporting editorial triage. So that gives the editor a structured way of thinking about the peer review feedback they're getting. And that may be an even more powerful intervention than providing peer review tools. They will be useful, but we think there may be other even more useful things that can also be done.
Okay. There's a question. Oh, go ahead, Sofia.
Yes, I saw the question from Horst, and I would like to reply on that. So actually,
can you just repeat what the question is that you're addressing? Yes. Is it about the NAMS databases?
Yeah, so Horst, it's asking concerning NAMS database, which is important for research and reviewers. There are many databases for animal models. However, there are only a few very limited databases for NAMS, which are the ones that you would recommend. So I think it was 5 years ago, my colleagues have published a study they had done on databases or sources of information on NAMS, and as a resources for people who wanted to use non-animal methods. And it was a pretty impressive list. And in this study that we started only internally, we started to analyze those databases actually also to see where it was information on protocols and methods. And we realized several of them, maybe even a lot of them, have been discontinued. So this is something that we struggle to recommend some kind of databases if we don't know exactly of the sustainability. And unfortunately, NAMS is still rather a small community and maybe not with a lot of funding to sustain all these initiatives. And the way that we wanted to do, it's trying to promote NAMS in the general platforms and not the ones that are specific for NAMS. We saw, for instance, there are the Equator guidelines, which are guidelines also for publications to be followed. And we also realized there is not a lot there on NAMS. But for instance, we know the NC3Rs, and we are collaborating with them also in this initiative, are developing the river guidelines. So trying to promote there, trying to promote also a bit of giving. So we wanted with this initiative, which is life science, to promote the methods in general, in a way that we would push the NAMS to the same standards. And then maybe on the next phase, we would focus from this point on of doing a campaign more focused on NAMS, on journals that are more about NAMS. So we were thinking, yeah, in terms of database, not focus on specific on NAMS, but give the resources for NAMS to be as good as the others.
Thank you, Sofia. We've come to the top of the hour. I think there was a lot of interest in these topics. Very happy to have you both here today, and thank you for your time. You can continue to answer some of the questions in the chat. The webinar and the slides will be posted within a few days to the ASCCT website. That link is in the chat, and these are all open. So if you want to share the webinar with your colleagues, you'll be able to do that. You can direct them to the ASCCT website. So thank you, Sofia, Paul, and wish you luck on next steps in your work. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and see you all in the new year for our award winner presentations. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.